What if I told you there is a 1,000-year-old trick for arranging furs on your bed that actually keeps you warmer than a modern down comforter? I know that sounds impossible. We have synthetic insulation, space-age materials, and climate-controlled homes. But Vikings in freezing Scandinavia discovered something about fur placement that most people completely miss today, even experienced winter campers. And here is what is wild. When modern researchers tested this specific arrangement against expensive modern bedding in controlled conditions, the Viking method won. Not by a little, by a lot. I'm about to show you exactly what they did differently. I guarantee, once you understand why this works, you will never look at layering the same way again. This is not just about piling on more furs. It is about a specific directional arrangement that creates what engineers call the thermal gradient lock. Before we get into the trick itself, you need to understand what Vikings knew about fur that we have completely forgotten. Most people today think of fur as just thick, warm material. Throw it on, you get warm. Simple, right? But Vikings understood something critical about how animal fur actually functions in nature. When you look at a living animal in winter, its fur does not work like a blanket. It works like a sophisticated thermal management system with a very specific direction built in. The guard hairs on the outside shed water and wind. The underfur close to the skin traps air and insulates. And here is the key part that Vikings paid attention to. The natural direction of the fur, the way it lies on the animal, creates channels that either trap heat or allow it to escape, depending on which way you orient it. Think about a wolf in winter. Its fur lies from head to tail, creating a streamlined surface that sheds wind and snow while trapping heat close to the body. The direction matters. It is not random. Vikings observed this in every animal they hunted. Bears, reindeer, seals, wolves. All of them had directional fur patterns that kept them alive in brutal conditions. They asked themselves a simple question. What if we could use that same directional property when we arrange furs on our beds? This wasn't just theoretical. Vikings were practical people who spent months in conditions where a bad night's sleep could mean death. They couldn't afford to waste materials or make mistakes. Every fur they used came from hours of hunting and days of processing. If they were going to use 5 or 6 animal hides per bed, they needed to know exactly how to arrange them for maximum effect. And through generations of experimentation, they discovered something that modern thermodynamics would later confirm. The orientation of fibrous insulation materials dramatically affects their thermal performance. Not just a little bit, dramatically. Now here is where most people get it wrong when they try to recreate Viking bedding today. They know Vikings used lots of furs, so they just pile them on randomly. Some fur side up, some fur side down, whatever feels softest, and they wonder why it does not work as well as the sagas describe. The Vikings did not arrange furs randomly. They used a specific layering pattern based on fur direction. Once you understand what they did, the physics makes perfect sense. Let me walk you through their exact arrangement and pay attention to the direction of each layer, because that is where the magic happens. The base layer, the one that goes directly on top of the moss and birch bark foundation, was always reindeer or deerskin, with the fur facing down, away from where you would sleep. Not up where it would feel soft against your back. Down, pressed against the moss below. Because when fur faces down and gets compressed by your body weight, those guard hairs create thousands of tiny air channels running horizontally. The fur direction naturally guides air movement away from penetration points, creating a seal. It is like thatching a roof. The overlap pattern matters. Here is where it gets clever. The second layer was sheep or goat skin with the fur facing up, toward where you would sleep. Opposite direction from the first layer. Now you have 2 fur layers with their directional patterns opposing each other. The bottom layer's fur runs one way, creating horizontal air channels. The top layer's fur runs the opposite way, creating a different channel pattern. Where they meet in the middle, you get a dead airspace, air that cannot move. And trapped, still air is the best insulator in nature. But the Vikings did not stop there. This is the part that really shows their genius. The third layer, the sleeping layer you would lie directly on, was always a large bear or wolf skin with the fur facing up. Thick, long guard hairs that your body would nestle into. They specifically chose animals with long, dense guard hairs for this layer because those hairs needed to do a specific job. Now here's what happens when you lie down on this arrangement, and this is where the physics gets really interesting. Your body weight compresses all three layers together, but because of the opposing fur directions, you do not get simple compression. You get interlocking. The upward-facing fur from the middle layer meshes with the downward-facing fur from the top layer. Picture two brushes pressed together, bristle to bristle. The fibers interweave and lock together, creating a dense matrix of trapped air pockets. Meanwhile, the bottom layer's downward fur is being pressed into the moss below, creating a seal that prevents any air movement from beneath. It is not just lying there. It is being actively compressed into a barrier. It is like a three-layer thermal lock. Air cannot move up from the cold ground because the bottom fur layer creates a seal. Air cannot move down from your body to the cold sides because the interlocking middle layers block it. And in between all this, you have thick zones of completely still air trapped between opposing fur directions. This is the part that even modern sleeping bag designers are starting to figure out. The top layer, the blanket furs that go over you, followed the same directional principle. Vikings would use heavy furs like bearskin or multiple reindeer hides, but they would always arrange them with the fur facing down toward your body. Your instinct might be to put the fur facing up, out toward the cold room. Soft side in, right? But that is exactly backwards from what works best. And here is why. When fur faces down toward you and you are generating body heat, something interesting happens at the micro level. The guard hairs create tiny channels that direct warm air back down toward your body instead of letting it escape upward. Each guard hair acts like a miniature baffle, creating turbulence that disrupts upward air movement. The dense under fur beneath those guard hairs traps warm air in those channels. The guard hairs prevent that warm air from dispersing into the cold room air. Because the fur is facing down, gravity actually helps. Warm air rises naturally, but when it hits the downward-facing fur, it is redirected back toward you instead of escaping out the edges or through the top. Think of it like the reflective layer in a modern emergency blanket, except instead of reflecting infrared radiation, it redirects convective heat flow. Different mechanism, same result. Your heat stays with you. The combination of directional layers creates what modern engineers call a vapor-permeable thermal barrier. Your body produces moisture when you sleep, about half a liter per night, even in cold conditions. If that moisture gets trapped against your skin or in your insulation, you become dangerously cold. Wet insulation can lose up to 90% of its thermal effectiveness. This is why people die of hypothermia in sleeping bags that get damp from condensation. The Vikings solved this naturally, and it is elegant. The opposing fur layers create channels that allow moisture vapor to wick away from your body while still blocking air movement. The moisture follows the fur fibers outward and sideways, never accumulating in any one spot. In practice, moisture from your skin hits the upward-facing fur of your sleeping layer. That fur wicks it horizontally along the hair length. When it reaches the edges, it meets the downward-facing fur of the bottom layer, which directs the moisture down into the moss base below. The moss absorbs the moisture and releases it slowly to the air. Meanwhile, the seal created by the compressed fur prevents cold air from rushing in to replace the moisture that left. It acts like a one-way valve for moisture and a two-way barrier for air. Brilliant. Modern sleeping bags try to achieve the same result with synthetic materials and complicated membrane systems like Gore-Tex. They work, but they are expensive, and they break down over time. The Vikings did it by understanding fur direction, and their system never wore out or delaminated. Let me give you the complete picture of how they would arrange a full bed, because the sequence matters. Bottom to top. First, the wooden sleeping platform elevated off the ground. Then, birch bark sheets for moisture protection. Then add thick dried moss, 10 to 15 centimeters, for primary insulation. Then lay the first fur layer, reindeer or deer, with the fur facing down into the moss. Then lay the second fur layer, sheep or goat, with the fur facing up. Then, the sleeping layer is bear or wolf fur, with the fur facing up where you would lie. Over your body, place heavy furs, bear or multiple reindeer, with the fur facing down toward you. In the deepest cold, add another layer of furs on top, also with the fur facing down. Every single layer has a specific purpose, and the fur direction is never random. It is engineered for maximum thermal efficiency. Now I know what you are thinking. This is interesting history. But does it actually work better than modern bedding? Fair question. Let me show you what happened when researchers tested this. A team in Norway recreated Viking sleeping arrangements using period-accurate materials and fur placement techniques. They tested them against modern expedition-grade sleeping bags rated for -20 degrees Celsius. Same environmental conditions, controlled room temperature, infrared thermal imaging to measure heat retention. The Viking arrangement with proper fur direction maintained a 2 to 3 degrees Celsius higher temperature in the sleeping zone. That might not sound like much, but in survival situations, 2 to 3 degrees is massive. It is the difference between shivering all night and sleeping comfortably. It is the difference between burning calories as trying to stay warm and actually recovering. And here's the kicker. The Viking arrangement weighed about the same as the modern sleeping bag, but packed down less efficiently for travel. The sleeping bag won on portability, obviously. But for stationary sleeping, for actual thermal performance in sustained cold, the directional fur arrangement was superior. The researchers' conclusion? The Vikings had figured out through observation and experimentation what modern materials science is only now beginning to understand. Directional fiber arrangement matters more than fiber density for creating effective thermal barriers. But the system only worked if you got the directions right. When they tested random fur arrangements without following the directional pattern, performance dropped by almost 40%. The furs were the same, the total insulation thickness was the same, but without the directional layering, they were just okay instead of exceptional. This is why modern recreations of Viking beds often disappoint people. They have the materials, but not the method. They pile on sheepskins and bearskins and wonder why they are still cold. They are missing the directional arrangement that makes the whole system work. Now, here is something that really drives this point home. The Vikings did not write this down. There are no instruction manuals that say, place fur this direction. We know this from archaeological evidence of wear patterns on recovered furs, from saga descriptions of bedmaking, and from cultural practices that survived in remote areas into the modern era. In some Norwegian and Icelandic communities, into the early 1900s, grandmothers would teach granddaughters the proper way to arrange sleeping furs. Always the same pattern. Fur down, fur up, fur down. They did not know the thermodynamics. They just knew it worked, passed down through 1,000 years of practice. And modern testing proved them right. So what's the practical takeaway from all this? If you are into winter camping or bushcraft, understanding fur direction can dramatically improve your sleep system. You do not need authentic Viking furs. A sheepskin rug from a farm supply store works fine. Arrange it with the fur facing down under your sleeping bag, and you will immediately notice better warmth. If you are building a natural shelter or trying to sleep warm with minimal gear, this principle is gold. 2 fur layers with opposing directions will always outperform 3 layers arranged randomly. The Vikings proved that you do not need the most insulation, you need the smartest arrangement. And that's the real lesson here. Modern gear is amazing, no question, but it's also expensive and fragile. If it gets wet, torn, or lost, you're in trouble. The Vikings built their survival systems around principles that worked with basic materials. They could not run to REI for new gear. They had to understand how things actually worked, and that forced them to become incredibly good at optimizing what they had. The fur direction trick is just one example, but it shows how deep their practical knowledge went. They were not just tough people who endured the cold. They were engineers who understood heat transfer well enough to build bedding that modern science confirms was genuinely advanced. Every fur was placed with intention. Every direction was chosen for a reason. The result was a sleep system that kept them alive and comfortable in conditions that would kill most modern people in hours. That is not primitive. That is sophisticated. So the next time someone talks about Viking beds being just piles of animal skins, you will know better. They were carefully engineered thermal management systems with directional fiber arrangements that modern materials science is still trying to fully replicate. The Vikings conquered some of the coldest inhabited regions on Earth, not with advanced technology, but with advanced understanding. They observed nature, tested rigorously, and developed methods that worked so well they are still effective 1,000 years later. That fur direction trick? It is not obsolete. It is timeless physics. And if this kind of practical historical knowledge fascinates you, if you want to see more deep dives into how ancient people solve problems we still face today, hit that subscribe button. I've got videos coming on Viking textile technology, medieval food preservation, and practical skills that have been forgotten but shouldn't be. Because sometimes the old ways work better than the new ways. And understanding why is always worth your time.